Adam, this is literally, in my opinion, the third best album ever made in the history of recorded sound. So I want to start by taking it from the EP beforehand. Already been pretty groundbreaking at the time that the Pretty Hate Machine had come out, to say the least. But there were still hangovers from that point in time where you could feel the influences on their sleeve. That became a little bit less with Fixed and Broken, I think. What was the feeling around Trent and Nine Inch Nails from everyone going into the Downward Spiral? Were there a lot of eyes and ears waiting for it, or was it still a more niche proposition at that point?
Oh, that's a good question. And I think there's a couple of sides to that. I think what they became known as quite early on, or the Nine Inch Nails entity became known as quite early, is the band that takes around 5 years or so to make an album. That is a full album, as opposed to a mini album or a series of EPs. And that kind of I think that kind of hamstrung them a bit, because obviously you got 89 Pretty Hate Machine, 94 Downward Spiral, 99 The Fragile, and then you've got 2005 with Teeth. So it's it's just these wacky gaps. I think I miscalculated there, but you've got these crazy gaps.
Yeah.
And then I think 89 Pretty Hate Machine debut album does quite well considering. And then Broken lands in 92. And that actually sold really well. And as you say, the big step change was from kind of synth pop meets industrial / a bit of goth into almost an acceleration into metal territory, and going really heavy, but trying to push the limits of heaviness and what you can achieve with the technology, let alone just a heavy rock band in a room, trying to capture that sound and compress it into a record. And I think for that time that was still quite a challenge, to get the full intensity of what it must have sounded like in the room.
And what would you say was the metal that was influential to Reznor? Because he at that point in time, because the thing is, when it comes to the world of heavy music and his association with, I feel that he's always had a quite complicated relationship with it. I don't think it's something that he certainly has never courted it. And I'm not sure he ever even really felt part of the tapestry of the world of rock and metal. But what metal would you say was influencing him going into Fixed and Broken and therefore the Spiral?
That's a really good question. Do you know what? I think metal-wise, it's really hard to pin down. And he talks about a range of influences anyway. I mean, obviously, when he's talking about Broken, I mentioned this in the book, he talks about Prince a fair bit, and that comes out more on the Downward Spiral. But I think, weirdly, he kind of looked to Prince for intensity and delivery. So it's not drop D, intense riffing, kind of screaming lyrics and stuff to just, generalize metal massively for a moment.
Of course.
But I think he was definitely looking for that kind of overdriven extremity that Prince would often deliver and then reach out in various directions. But in terms of actual metal bands, there wasn't much that came up for me. He talks a lot about industrial and literally Cleveland bands. But he obviously talks a lot about Ministry and Revolting Cocks and Front 242. It's a really long list. But do you know what? When you say metal, I actually kind of draw a blank.
Yeah, that's it. It's fascinating. Can I ask you a little bit further about that Prince stuff? Because in my opinion, everyone who's in the chat will know this because I say it all the time. I believe that Prince and Trent are literally 1 and 2 as the biggest geniuses to ever walk into the game. So when you say Prince, what kind of thing was it with the Prince connection that he was looking for? Because in my head, I think to myself, in that early 90s period was when Prince was making really sonically impressive records when it comes to big sound. Like my mind goes to My Name Is Prince and how massively aggressive the percussion sounds on it. So it makes a lot of sense. But what else is that correlation that we might not know about?
I think with Prince, it's the fact that this is where he's ironically quite underrated. He was a genius guitarist. He still is on record. He's a genius guitarist, and when he improvises and pulls out solos, they're always like impressive and reaching. They're not the most obvious thing, and I think there's maybe like a bit of a Jimi Hendrix connection there. It's a bit of a reach, but that's what I'm going with. And I think when it comes to Trent's music, he just looked at someone who didn't necessarily repeat himself. So, you talk about drum sound and intensity and stuff. Prince did so much stuff that was electronic-y and sort of preempted some of the synth pop. I think like minimalism and like the cleanness and the fineness of the sound. So a really obvious example of that at the moment would be something like Sign of the Times. And we're having like the anniversary edition of that. Not anniversary edition, but like the crazy expanded edition.
Yeah.
With all these extra songs. I've not even heard it. I mean, it's quite an investment, but like, out of Prince albums, that's probably my one. And that album is really broad, going from like really stripped back stuff where it's just like weird little drum loops and tape squiggles and stuff, to, really full on burning guitar. And so there's obviously a big influence there, but I think when it comes to the Downward Spiral a bit later, it's really all about kind of like the grooves and the harmonies and the falsetto. Trent never really had the range of someone like Prince, because obviously his range was like electric and elastic at the same time. But just that virtuosity, he didn't have that, but he was really smart guy because he knew his limits and he knew what he could do with his voice. And so I think he put loads of like Prince-isms into the record, but it doesn't sound like Prince. And I think that's a really cool thing where like you absorb and give tribute, if you like, to your influences, but you don't just replicate them. You don't just tack on a Prince-like sound. You kind of you're inspired by them, not emulating them. And there's a weird little story, just briefly, like Prince had Broken, and Trent heard that Prince liked Broken, and he'd heard the guitar sound. He was like, "Fuck me, that's amazing," because it's obviously super, super layered, super, super dense. Just whacking like track upon track upon track, which at the time still was relatively hard to do because you didn't necessarily have purely digital giant mixing desks and so on, like you do now, where you can just stack up basically data files, And Trent and Prince passed each other in a corridor in a studio somewhere. It might have been A&M studio, where he did some of Broken and he did a little bit of the Downward Spiral as well. And Prince apparently didn't necessarily blank him, but just didn't really acknowledge, he didn't really register or something.
Right.
And that was it. That was his interaction with his hero. There wasn't like a hello or a handshake or even really a nod. It was kind of like two people just passing. And maybe that's as close as Trent ever got to his hero. But I think hearing, and you can maybe assume it was true, that someone was inspired by your sound, that you were originally inspired by their sounds, that must be a really amazing feeling.
And it all came full circle with the Johnny Cash thing as well later on down the line. It just like all of the heroes like in a circle, the Bowie tours and fucking it felt like he always connected with people on a musical level that were the people that he looked up to. What I particularly interested in when we talk about Nails' 90s output, right, is how fucking great these records sound to this day versus how difficult it was to make those electronic sounds. Like today, an album like that coming out, an album like The Spiral coming out would just be equally as mind-melting. But to do it with the technological restrictions and the Jesus fucking Christ, how hard it must have been with floppy disks and all kinds of bullshit. Like, is it a fair point to say that was it was it a love affair with technology, or was it a battle with technology, the making of the Downward Spiral, would you say?
I think like a lot of these questions, I'm going to cop out and say both. But I mean,
Yeah, no, not a problem at all.
no, it's a really good question. It was, yeah, it was really like a push and pull. And I think what's interesting about Trent, as opposed to some musicians, he'd be like, I've plugged in my guitar, set up my mic, and then just, absorb what I give to you in my performance. Reznor's more like, what can I do with this, with both sides of the process? Like what I capture, what I play, and then what can I maybe do with it afterwards, like post-production, more like a film. And he said, yeah, he was really like looking in like multiple directions at the same time. He was never just like, I play, whack it on a tape. And there's lots of strange stuff about how they recorded. So that, they had like analog tapes, but they also had loads of it digitally recorded. So I think at the end of the day, because at that era, analog was still quite cool and like really warm, full, rich sound, which, a lot of people these days would still subscribe to, and I totally get that.
I do. I'm one of those people entirely. I love everything modern and the way that technology moves, but like, if you don't sound like human beings playing music, you lose all heart, soul, and authenticity to my ears.
Yeah, sure. And it's the fact that like NLP, a really good quality one, has like very high fidelity, and it's like it's hard to explain that. It's like it has lots of sound and lots of clarity, and you can pick out individual layers, which sounds stupid because it's like, what do you mean? It's just a load of sound. It's like, yeah, it's all coming at you, but if you give it enough time and you sit back, you can kind of like hear the different things coming through and in and out. And that's a really interesting thing, because that's something that people really, when I did like a bit of research and chat to fans and stuff, some people really like about the Downward Spiral in general. As you say, it kind of sounded ahead of its time, because it's super clear, super crisp. And what I like is it's the kind of music you can put on that you don't have to, like a lot of 70s stuff, even though it's very well recorded, you don't have to whack up the volume just to be able to kind of feel it and get some impact from it. It's like, they didn't have the technology that back then. I think of like Led Zeppelin especially. I don't think Jimmy Page was perhaps the best producer. He's a really good guitarist. But he didn't necessarily like capture...
That's why he had Glyn and Andy Johns about.
Yeah. And it's just like, those records sound kind of thin, a bit papery, whereas this is 20 years later, give or take. And Reznor's like thing just like hits you really fierce. So I just like, I think it's really amusing that he did a remaster for the vinyl reissue like 2016, which is quite recent to be fair. And I was like, oh, this sounds super crisp, super clear. This is brilliant. Compared to so many of my other LPs, including, modern contemporary stuff, not from 26 years ago. And it's just like, I was like, did he maybe not have to do anything? He maybe just put it out on vinyl again. It's like, really good grade vinyl. He didn't actually have to mess with the mastering too much. But yeah, sorry, back to your question. I think what's really cool is that he was taking the sound as you would normally do it in sort of like best practice, super clear, really warm, kind of rich quality, and then fucking with it digitally. And I think some of the stuff that really makes me laugh about his processes, but at the time would have been cutting edge and, looking far ahead, is he had like, the earliest Mac computers, which are these great big sort of like roundy, boxy blobs where everything's self-contained. You didn't have a tower and stuff. And then I think he was getting like the early laptops, or really, some of the better laptops in like 99. You're doing the Fragile. You see him with this like really chunky, thick thing. It's like a little brick with a wee screen coming out. And he's using those bloody machines, which we would see as just arcane, because we've got like mobile phones, and we've got like Chromebooks, these like, and MacBook Airs, and these skinny little beasts that just run on Wi-Fi anyway. It's all clouded. And he's using these like really digitally clunky Kajiga machines to try and process things. And one of the things I thought was really striking, and I had to kind of get my head around this because I'm not like technically gifted myself in any way, as we had with the webcam earlier. He's sitting there trying to manipulate and alter sounds, but it doesn't do it real time, which things like Pro Tools now, which is basically, I was going to say synonymous, that's not quite the right word, but it's not synonymous with recording music, but it's basically everywhere, let's put it that way. And all those different kind of systems you can use, different kinds of production stuff, but things like Pro Tools are essentially for sort of like fixing stuff that's maybe not great. And then how auto-tune was there to do repairs and then became another thing to like abuse, which Kanye West did so well, I think. But then that became abused. It was like, oh, fucking hell. It just sort of like went out of hand.
Always the way, mate.
Yeah, but he was basically changing stuff, but then he had to sit and wait for it to load. So imagine you do all this work, recording his work and stuff.
Yeah.
He spent a year, more or less, and it's no good or it's not quite right. It's like, oh, I'll change it again. Okay, loading. It's like so much work. Whereas people like the Rolling Stones back in the day would be like, let's just knock out the tracks. And they were really fucking good. But they just weren't those kind of musicians, They were kind of like 4-piece combo, bit of organ and piano. Whereas Trent Reznor's trying to take a real sound and then make it synthetic. And then other times he talks about taking a very synthetic sound and trying to make it sound warm again and like human and almost faulty, to try and kind of like break it so that it has that slight influence of like fault and digression and coarseness, that you get from the real thing. And that's such an interesting tension. And I think that still goes throughout his work. And you can't say that for a lot of musicians, I don't think. They want everything to sound perfect and slick, so they don't have to mess with it, or people don't complain and say, oh, it's like it's a little bit rough or something. It's like, that's not really what music's about.
Could I ask about the layering that you spoke about earlier, and the sheer, because like I've read so many things over the years, and I would love to get your perspective on it as someone that has spent an entire time writing a book about it. But
sure,
some of the techniques used at the time, before we get into the environment it was recorded in and all the rest of it, but the ideas at the time, and he was using things like big long chains for percussion and shit like that, I have read in the past. Is there a lot of outside the box mad thinking that you can hear in all of those layers on the record?
I think so. I think there's loads of strange stuff. I think the really, hopefully this isn't like too boring for people. Like the really like apocryphal story is about like Broken, and he's just talking about guitar tracks, and he's like, okay, it's actually quite basic maths, but it takes a bit of like rejigging your head around. For me, it did anyway. But basically, it's like I play a bit of guitar and I play it like half speed, what I would have done. So I don't know, I've written a riff or I've put some chords together, and I'll play it like nice and slow compared to how I'd actually play it at a gig. And so it would hit people with this force and stuff. And so you play at half speed, and then you take it on the computer and you whack it up to, let's say, full speed, what you would have played it at. But in reality, that's going double because you're getting it back up to what we might call normal, right?
Yeah.
So it's half speed, get it back to normal, but then put it up to double so that it is actually fast, as opposed to just, let's say, medium, moderate.
Yeah.
And that pushes up the, that can like push up the tone and things like that and the pitch. And so you get like a slightly, let's say, like higher sound. But the long and the short of it is he's like purposefully playing it wrong and then fixing it, so to speak, but then pushing it to a further extreme. So there's actually a really fast piece of guitar, but it's kind of like thick and sludgy and dense. And that's a really like strange, I think, a really strange original way of looking at making music.
It's very him.
I hadn't actually heard the chain story myself, but like there's loads of great little bits. There's a thing with the song, I don't think it's Pilgrimage, it's the marching song on the Fragile, where it's like yeah, I don't know what you, that sounds a bit Marxist in the background. Yeah, depending on your politics, right?
Yeah,
it's very like totalitarian kind of vibe.
Yeah.
And the marching sound for that, it's like a lot of Foley artists, who are the people who make the sounds for the movies, where they do anything but the actual thing that they're trying to make the sound of. Do these like crazy experiments just to try and capture what is in people's imagination of how things actually sound. He's there with a cardboard box with loads of bits and pieces like thrown into it and going and just shaking a box. But on the record, I wouldn't even say it sounds like feet, but it gives the impression of feet. It gives that vibe. And when it comes to the downward spiral, I think Trent was more about pushing the technology to make the sounds sound unlike themselves. So like things like guitar, and to make it sound maybe a bit more like an organ or a synth or a keyboard. And then if he had something like a synth, which is obviously before I think people like Trent Reznor came along, to be fair, but also other industrial bands, was considered the slightly effete, light, almost like
I blame Jump by Van Halen.
yeah. I mean, there's barely any notes there. It's not even virtuosity. It's not even punk. It's just bland. It's like a riff you thought of when you just woke up first thing in the morning. It's like, yeah, that'll do. And he took something like the synth and made it like aggressive and vibrant and I wouldn't even say primitive, but just like, he gave it like edge and power and movement. So like the synths and the guitars on the record, and obviously things like the drums and the weird percussion, nothing is ever quite as it seems. And I think that's a really cool way to think of it, because if you enter the record into that spirit, it's like you really are in a slightly different space from your 4-piece combo band, just doing their instruments. And that's where, the whole Nine Inch Nails idea comes in, because on the records, I think from the start, he always credits Nine Inch Nails as Nine Inch Nails is Trent Reznor. These days, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross and other people chipping in, obviously. And I think he's always been like generous to people who've actually played parts on stuff. But overall, it's him as the auteur, like the crazy ass director, doing everything, or at least overseeing everything. And then taking it as far as he can go. And I don't think anyone else around, even like a co-producer of some kind, would necessarily have had the same vision, the same reach, and the same willingness to push things, because the producer, I think, would be more like looking at his watch, saying, Can we please get some work done? Can we get some basic tracks down? And they're kind of all basic tracks, because they're layers of atmosphere or emotion, or even just samples,
May I ask, Adam, what is your interpretation of how much Nine Inch Nails were a band at this time? Because it just depends which one of those musicians you ask. You ask Robin Fink, we all had something to do. You ask Richard Patrick, you're fucking throwing a grenade. But what's your having written a book on it, and like Reznor's the hub and the other, in my opinion, and like, God, I don't mean it to sound as reductive as this, because there are some real geniuses around him. I think Chris Verrena's ability with sound is fucking brilliant, right?
Yeah.
But my opinion is that it's Trent's band and everyone else is pretty lucky to be there. How much of a band were Nine Inch Nails as they made the Downward Spiral, and who else was involved in recording and that kind of thing? Because one would imagine he might have handled a lot of it himself in the studio.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because you look at the credits like a lot of, freaks like us do, and you're just like, who did this? Who did that? Who was actually there? Who was in the room, and what impact did they play? Or was it like, hit the drum, give me this kind of drum beat, and the person's like playing through. So no, not fucking like that. Like fucking this. Just give me the fucking sticks. Just fucking sit over there. No, don't look at the drum kit. Fucking sit down. Right, go in the next room. Okay, go home. I don't fucking need you. And I could just imagine that kind of power trip. I don't think it was. But you can imagine it's really escalate if someone's like, I have a really unique, singular vision. And I think someone like David Bowie is an example there of like being a really good musical director, and sometimes being more or less sympathetic And I think people like there, you'd have people who are very supportive, like Tony Visconti as producer, saying, "Please, lads, let's get a record done."
Yeah.
And Brian Eno saying, "Why don't we disrupt this process?" It's like, Brian, just let him play the damn piano. And then when you come to Reznor, he's actually got like a real skeleton crew. He's not got many people around him. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because you look at like Pretty Hate Machine and Broken and the tours and in the videos and stuff. It's all about being a band. It's all about putting that I don't know what you'd call it exactly, that full force kind of group together, us against the world, which is where bands really hang together and really succeed by the member units, if you like, all pulling together and backing each other up, because if you're not all involved and engaged, something doesn't work. It doesn't hang together. So he presented that kind of front, but I think when it came to the studio, he, like Bowie, he surrounded himself with strong musicians. And obviously by that time, 94, he'd done a lot of touring with not that many lineup changes, really. And people he knew from back in Cleveland, like I think Richard Patrick. I think he's actually from Cleveland.
Yep.
And then you look at the people who are involved in the record. There's Sean Bevan, who in that context, I think was actually on board as engineer as opposed to producer. I don't think there was a producer. I think it was Trent Reznor. And I managed to talk to Sean Bevan. He was really helpful, really generous guy. And he's done a lot of really significant music in general, things like Mechanical Animals with Marilyn Manson,
Nice.
which is an album I really love.
Same.
And Bevan was there, like really in a supportive role to help with the many different tasks of production. And then you talk about Chris Brenner, and he fills a really weird role now. He seems to barely play a note. He's generally there as once again, like gathering sound samples and stuff. So apparently he watched loads and loads of movies to find weird, interesting stuff. And they put like a mood board together, which I think is a really interesting way of approaching it, because it must have taken so much time and just effort, even on Chris Brenner's part, to actually be engaged. Like, I'm not just watching movies, I'm trying to support my friend and my fellow artist.
What was on that mood board, Adam?
They painted it in broad strokes. It would be good to see it, wouldn't it? Because I don't think Post-its were invented then. You didn't have like your digital task list.
I just wondered if they mentioned like any of the movies or any of the specific things, because it was it was such a good time for creative. I always say that particular period, the post Nirvana period, right, is when the Freaks ran the asylum for a half a decade, and it was fucking wonderful in the shape of movies and art and music and all that kind of thing. So it would be interesting to know if there was any of those things that stood out.
I'll be honest, I didn't have loads of detail in terms of the mood board thing, but it was very much around like melancholy, like depressive, dark, those kind of like basically all within the same palette, but different densities of strokes, if you like, because it's a very dark album, when you say. But looking for things that fitted in there, and then seeing where they could actually be used in a track. And some of it is like purely, I go back to like the Foley artists and stuff. So it's like really physical sound. It's like coarse, it's crazy. So things like a swarm of bees and stuff, and then like manipulated to sound a bit like a sort of guitar attack, but it's bees. It's like, it just sounds ridiculous. But insects was actually a really insects were a weird little like conceptual thing that kind of creeped throughout the album and in the artwork as well, in a physical way, but just as a sort of vibe, because you've got that idea of like the individual and the swarm and the mass and the collective, and then obviously you've got songs like Reptile and stuff which make that really visceral. Anyway, there was a few weird films, like because it was 94, there was a Hangover, so I know what you mean about 90s films, but I think a lot of the really cool films were kind of yet to come. And so he was looking a little bit earlier to like the late 80s, some really weird stuff, like a film called Leviathan. Someone told me that was a good film from back in the day, but there's like a alien type airlock kind of noise. It's not from Alien, it's from Leviathan, which is a really weird alien type film, but it actually all happens under the sea. So I don't really know. I haven't seen it, but it's just alien underwater is what I'm guessing. That's the vibe.
Yeah.
But most people think it's alien, and then there's the strange stuff where it's like a sample of a camera shutter, and then slightly slowed down. I think that's for I think that's actually for Reptile.
It would make sense.
It's the crazy
yeah.
thing. And it really freaks you out because you're like, is it broken? Is there something wrong? Because the whole record has that kind of broken machine vibe, and that's like passable onto the narrator, the voice on the record, but also like, oh my god, is it just he's trying to show the sound of technology and machinery, the physical and the digital clashing and breaking down all at once, which is a real headfuck, obviously. Because it's like metaphorical, but it's also physical. It's just what you're hearing. And you're like, is that what he's actually trying to say about stuff, or is it just the vibe? And then just there's some other collaborators. So there's people like Adrian Belew, who's like a really interesting, crazy guitarist who worked with King Crimson, David Bowie. I think also with Talking Heads at one time as well.
That would make sense.
A lot of people I think are probably touchstones for Reznor, but also because he's slightly like wild card player, someone who would bring something really different to the table. And I think he only pops up on a couple of tracks, and it doesn't. He's not really like there like just a solo or something like someone like Robert Fripp would be on David Bowie records. It's amazing effects, so good. King Crimson as well. Belew is more there, like adding what I think Reznor refers to as textures and stuff. So it's this idea of like someone's not necessarily playing a riff or an arpeggio, picking through the notes of a chord. They're just getting sound out of their instrument, probably through shitloads of effects, but it's all adding to the overall aura of the track, which feeds into the atmosphere of the record overall. Sorry, I hope that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. I wanted to just shift gears a little to talk about the environment in which this was made. So, if you've seen Once Upon a Time if you've seen the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, right? Basically, the last 20 minutes or so of it, that house where things actually happened, not Leonardo DiCaprio stopping it with flamethrowers. Spoilers, sorry, you've had long enough. But that house is where this record was made, correct?
Yeah. So it's the house at 150 Cielo Drive. So I guess that's what, 10,050? I don't know how it works in American address.
Well, I can tell you it's about 25 minutes from where I'm sat right now.
There you go, but you feel great about that.
Hail Satan!
And that was the house where Sharon Tate was murdered, along with her unborn child, and I believe 5 friends. And there was also the La Bianca house, pretty much down the road. I think the area is called Benedict Canyon, and so it's in the hills overlooking LA. And the series of murders carried out by Charles Manson's family followers, so not Charles Manson himself, but obviously he was implicated in motivating and helping to plan and basically directing, for want of a better word, directing the murders. And it's really interesting with the house. The common story that Trent has put across is that he saw like 15 houses in a day. He was trying to go to New Orleans. It didn't work out. He's like, fuck it, I'll just rent somewhere in LA because it's, music land. And he saw a load of places. He's like, yeah, this one.
Do we believe that?
In a word, no.
No, me neither, man.
I also don't hold it against him. I think I think he got some weird backlash. So Sharon Tate's sister was upset with him because she felt that
Yeah.
just in recording there, he was kind of like, uh, trying to claim, some sort of weird inspiration and, almost like the ghost influence off of the house and basically cash in and monopolize on what had gone on there. But I don't think that's really fair necessarily. I think he made a really dark record that, even though it has a lot of like weird correlations with Manson and the White Album and the Charles Manson helter skelter theory of a coming race war, all sorts of like crazy, quite weird coincidences, which in some ways are reasonably powerful, I think. It wasn't his intention in choosing it, but I do think there was perhaps a bit of gallows interest, if not gallows humour, in selecting the place. So, as everyone knows, and it's mentioned in the liner notes, so fuck me, he didn't have to say this, did he? But in the liner notes, he christened the house Le Pig.
I
And that was
mean,
Pig, written in Sharon Tate's blood on the front door. And it's just amazing, like how we view and commemorate and mark history or not, because by the time he came to rent it, it was a long time after it happened, 20-ish years, going on 30, and the blood was still there on the front door. It just had a fresh lick of paint, and the paint was slightly flaking off. So you can sort of see in the photographs it's kind of showing through, and so. What was he necessarily supposed to think? And there was still so much interest in someone like Charles Manson, who was still alive at that time. Anyway, I think he chose a quiet place that was close to the city, but not too close, where he could just go and do, a decent day and night's work and live there and just get on with stuff. And I think in the long run, it worked out cheaper than the studio. It didn't cost him that much to rent it. And he made a custom studio. So what was then Interscope helped him set up his own label, Nothing Records, through which he recorded Marilyn Manson, which is quite a big deal. And Jimmy Iovine also granted him within the deal, obviously you go rent this house and, we'll help you set up a custom studio. And he had like proper technicians come in and do it. So he was kind of able to like cherry pick his own gear. And that must have been like quite a daunting thing, like, late 20s and stuff. Like even at his age, like your follow-up album proper, build your own studio, yeah, but you're gonna have to learn how to use it. So it's really impressive what he was able to pull off in, like you say, the environment, but also with tech, because he was trying to use the latest stuff and get to grips with it and make sure he came out with a passable record, at least, let alone something that sounds quite groundbreaking and fresh even now. But yeah, I think the vibe of the house must have had some influence. It must have been a strange place to be.
Now, I have a friend who interviewed Trent for Kerrang magazine at the time that the Downward Spiral came out, and it was his opinion that I will use his exact word. It was his opinion that Trent was channeling in that house.
Yeah.
How much credence would you give to channeling, and if you could give us a little bit of insight into what he was suggesting there?
I think it's a fair comment. Trent himself, I didn't actually put much of this in the book because I thought it was a bit, what's the word, esoteric. And I thought it was kind of reaching a little bit into the spiritual realm, whereas personally I believe more in the common psychic realm of a culture. For example, if we all share certain views, or we're all soaked in views around politics and so on, then we're kind of all in the same boat, and then you choose your position within that, as opposed to pure spirituality and things, as in believing in ghosts, is a whole separate thing that is not so common, and it's not necessarily grounded in reality, so to speak. It's perhaps more on perception. My point with that is that Reznor talked a little bit about, there's a weird vibe in the house, and there was loads of electrical faults, all the gear like turning off and shutting down completely. Personally, I think that was partly like pure tech fuck ups because they had so much stuff going on, and even with the technicians' help, who helped them set it up. Then they left. There was things that were bound to go wrong in a relatively old place. I think the house was actually built in the 30s, so it's a proper movie style place, even though it's a bungalow, and it was a luxury bungalow, and there was things like that. And then he also talked about hearing odd noises and things, but that doesn't necessarily inform the record directly, but I think the overall dark mood and the fact that he lived and worked there, and it seems like they were quite sequestered. They didn't really go anywhere. They actually blacked out the windows. The house was gated. It's a gated kind of community. It's that part of LA, as opposed to where everyone else lives. He was able to be a bit nomadic and go a little bit. Sorry, not nomadic. A little bit hermetic and go a little bit insane. And then reach away from that, because I don't think he was in the house for a full year, but it wasn't far off. He was there for a long time and working. So I would expect, when you still got blood stains around and knowing what went on, and even in those days, like, when you didn't have the internet at its full capacity, and so you couldn't just Google the police photographs from the scene of the crime, which are really, really graphic, and obviously they have to take so much stuff. It's really shocking stuff. Even then, you would have an awareness, and there were books that were around and so on. And he went out and bought, what's the guy, Vincent Bugliosi, I think, he was the prosecutor in the Charles Manson case. He went out and bought his book. I think it's called Helter Skelter. Nice. And it has the floor plan of the housing, because obviously with crime situations, you want to be able to talk through the line of events and so on, timeline. And he's like, I went out and bought the book, and I was like, oh fuck me, this is that room. Oh fuck me, this is that room. So he's, he schooled himself pretty quickly, and it is a really dark record, and it's not really about murder and stuff, but it is about challenging dark vibes. So perhaps being that space for so long made him feel a little bit shit. It just kind of brought him down a little bit, because it's very sad as well what happened, and that became a sort of like method acting type stimulus. I don't want to say that on Trent's behalf, but
no.
Maybe.
I think, what the only other question I wanted to ask about location is, LA's a pretty fucking mad place. In that, if that's where
it is in America, yes.
If that's where he'd rented, you can stay up there with rich folk and not see anyone even remotely close to your to the bracket of people that live up there. Or you can come down here to Hollywood, which has one of the maddest underbellies of any city I've ever been in. What was Trent's year in LA like, making this record?
I'm going to go on a limb here and say relatively dull. No, I seriously think he was mostly in the house.
Interesting.
And just chipping away.
It's because I can't see him being an LA person at all.
No. And what parties would he go to? Fellow musicians, but I don't think he'd go to the opening of Point Break or something like that.
Yeah, totally.
He wouldn't necessarily be invited. He might just have to queue with everyone else. But I think he kind of stuck himself in his work, and I think I got the vibe like he was kind of hurting from things. So related to what you were mentioning, like the vibe around Piggy and the narrative of that and where it stems from, I think is sort of like a couple of things, which is nice, because it's, rather than saying it's just one thing, it's about X or Y. Because people are more complicated, and our lives are more complicated than that. Is I think he mentions about having a breakdown of a relationship, so some kind of split, whether it was particularly long term or not, because that must have been very hard to maintain over the road, and being a really hard working recording artist, even though he wasn't necessarily the most prolific at that time. He had, he broke up with someone, and so he was sort of smarting from that. And then also there's the very recently infamous Richard Patrick story of Filter, and him basically the line is something like, Trent said I should go and deliver pizza or something. And it's not really true from what I read in my research. It's more like the manager at the time, a chap called John Malm, who was involved in the formation of Nothing Records. I think they actually knew him from Cleveland. So a guy they went quite far back with, even in those 5 years. He'd sort of said to him, like, look, there's not loads for you to do here, Richard, because you're kind of a guitar player. You maybe have aspirations of your own, grand. But look, if you kind of like literally roll the car down the hill, you arrive in, I don't know what the area is. I think it's Hollywood, but it's like the Brown Derby and stuff.
Yeah.
You're in that kind of area, and it's like literally 5-10 minutes down the hill. You could just kind of clutch the car or neutral or whatever it is in America, and just roll the fuck down, and then get yourself a little job there to tide you over. And what was really challenging, I think, for Richard Patrick is that he thought, well, look, I'm a good musician, I can contribute, and I want to support. But because of the publishing deals and stuff, and because it was Nine Inch Nails is Trent Reznor. There wasn't really any great financial reward for him, because anything he contributed to the songs, he wasn't going to get a royalty or anything like that. He might get a credit, but he wouldn't necessarily be financially rewarded, because there's like exclusivity around those things. So for him, there wasn't a great inducement to actually contribute loads musically, especially as Trent had such a singular vision and was kind of, if you want, on a sort of journey. Patrick felt really alienated and kind of fuck you by that. And it's these complicated things in the music industry.
It's a good job he's gotten over it over the years, though.
Yes and no. But,
I was totally being sarcastic, sorry.
I'm 50-50.
Bless him.
I don't blame him in some ways. But the thing is, he was with Trent for a long time, from the early days. And they worked really hard together on tour, and those things really mean something.
Of course.
But what the reality of it is, it's like there wasn't any great motivation for him to be that involved, because it's like, Trent can play loads of guitar bits himself. He's not necessarily a guitarist, but he did, I think, pretty much all of it himself. And so, Patrick got this kind of like fuck you from the manager, as in like, you're nothing. So it wasn't really encouraging for him, and he fucked off and did Filter, but he was actually getting really good offers of deals from several labels himself. So it was the best thing, really, for everyone in some ways. But it's an interesting set of circumstances. I'm really amused that this came up recently as a story, because people really harsh on like him. They're like saying, oh, he brings it up in every interview. Trent told me to do pizza, and I don't really imagine Trent would do that.
Yeah.
But long story short, it's daft that it came up, but I think there's an influence of that in Piggy, because it's like losing someone that you're close to. It's a different kind of relationship, but it's a bit of like, I love you and I hate you, like you annoy me, but I do care about what happens to you. Fuck off, but maybe we'll catch up together in the future. Yeah. And the theory is now they're kind of like on good talking terms and so on.
That's good. Because I thought the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, like, I know. To use the horrible media word, but snub might have put a fucking dagger in that heart forever.
Yeah, it's weird. It's weird that he wasn't in that like quite generous and inclusive list, because obviously he was there from the start for a good few years, as you say. But maybe you're only allowed so many people. It's like a fucking lifeboat situation.
And he has spent a lot of time kind of shitting on him in the press. So fair's fair. Can I ask about the concept itself? Because you were starting to talk about lyrics there with Piggy. Like, as a concept album, is it a thing that tells a story in beginning, middle, and end? Is there a theme that runs through it? The word concept album can mean about 15 different things. What does it mean when applied to the Downward Spiral? Yeah,
good question. I think it's kind of like a dirty concept album, in the sense of it's sort of non-linear, and it's more about expressing emotions and situations and challenges and things, instead of saying this event happened and this is how I feel about it. It's like more sort of impressionistic in that way, which suits like the musical palette of the record as well. There's a lot about like vibes rather than this is a slow song, this is a fast song, because even things like March of the Pigs have their like weird little ambient dance techno throb sections before the break again.
Yeah. Well,
And
yeah.
So yeah, lyrically and stuff, and in terms of theme content, I think the record's kind of all over the place, but it does obviously have that kind of like intense downward trajectory, which sort of drives it into that really harrowing, challenging place. Because there's loads of records out there at the time by really great bands and artists that were really fucking dark. He wasn't the first person to do that, but this album was a weird kind of like unique, self-contained thing, where you don't really know what's real. There's no cultural reference points. He doesn't talk about going to Denny's and stuff. He doesn't talk about what kind of car I drive. Those things aren't important. It's much more like a sort of vaguely spiritual, emotional, psychic journey, if you like. One person's sort of like descent into hell, if you want to be kind of broad strokes. So yeah, I think that's kind of like the overarching trajectory of it. You can't really deny it, even from the title of the album, right? But in terms of what it delivers, I think it just shows how people can experience a range of complicated, generally negative emotions, but some of that can still be like vital and thrilling. And this obviously comes through more in the music, as opposed to some of the lyrics. But it is about, in places, it is about love. It is about sex. It is about passion. It is about like spiritual reaching and self-discovery and things like that. So there's positive elements to it. It's not entirely nihilistic, but I think it's the struggle in trying to find those really good things through a load of really bad shit happening to you that we all have thrown at us in life. And that's the kind of thing that made it resonate. It wasn't actually, I think, such a high-minded thing. It was really visceral. It was like a punch to the gut, but it also kind of like grabbed you by the brain and encouraged you to fucking think, and question yourself. And it's like, oh, that's quite intense, because not a lot of records necessarily do that. They want you to have a good time. It might be a dirty, nasty, dark good time, but ideally they want to leave you with some kind of positive afterglow, so that you'll listen to it again and maybe like encourage the singles and stuff.
Like there's a movie there's a Russian language movie called Lilia Forever, and I put it on with the girl that I was seeing at the time, and the first 5 minutes of it is so bleak, and I was like, fucking hell, this is a start. And she's like, it's all downhill from here as well. And I always, when she said it, I remember thinking to myself, when you open with a song called Mr. Self-Destruct and you end with everyone I know goes away in the end, like, that's quite the bleak journey. Is it a bleak journey? Is there hope? And when you say spiritually reaching, I do want you to further on that, because that's fucking interesting.
Yeah, sure. I think there's ups and downs, and that sounds really like a bit blasé, but it's just like, I think like I say, there's so much music and great hooks and lines lyrically on there that are like really intense and exciting and vital, and they kind of demand you pay attention, like Mr. Self-Destruct from the start, but they don't necessarily like punish you, they don't necessarily pummel you. Like I think maybe a band like Slipknot does, and I'm not trying to do them down in this, it's just like they're a little bit more oppressive, they lack a bit of nous and stuff, but I think a lot of people don't necessarily feel like that. It's a bit of a
I will respectfully disagree and let you move on.
All right. But I mean, maybe they're in the same sort of camp as someone like Nine Inch Nails, and especially things like Downward Spiral.
Certainly with the layering and the depth and the idea of making evil sound fit heavy music.
Yeah, and so it's really energetic. as well. So I think like all those things kind of carry through, and that's why it's an album and it's not like a book or a series of angry blog posts, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's why I think in some ways it would make a great movie, so to speak. But that's kind of why it's not those things, because it's more amorphous, and I think as an individual we can all agree on the certain mood and vibe of things, but we all kind of take slightly different things from it. Some people, I think, would take it a bit more sci-fi and dystopian. Some people would take it more as like, oh, it's someone having a mental breakdown and things. Different blacks and whites, different greys, and when it comes to things like you mentioned sorry, what was it called? We're talking about the
spiritually reaching.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, and I think it's the kind of thing that in different times in their lives, and I kind of talked about this in the book, different times in their life, different people will have different emotional, physical challenges, and they'll affect you differently depending on your kind of like mental disposition, and also kind of your mental disposition towards mental health and stuff like that. But that's like, ultimately, that's, even though it's by degrees, that's something that loads of us can relate to. And I think what a song like Hurt achieves with the closing of the record, and it's not just Hurt, but over the course of the record, it achieves a kind of like reckoning with the self, and like, who are you? What am I about? There's a great leveling of like, what have I done wrong? Where was I responsible for things that weren't good in my life, as opposed to just being angry and lashing out at the world, because there's a lot of that as well. And because it gives you that other side of things, it's a really mature, thoughtful, I think, kind of like emotionally intellectual response. And what Hurt gives is the kind of like allowance that you can go through that process, but then perhaps be able to forgive yourself in understanding what you truly are and what you're like. It gives you the opportunity to change. Not necessarily to change who you are, because that's a bit much, but to make changes and things like that. And it gives you, like I say, the chance to forgive yourself for doing things badly, and you would have done them better, but also like that you are who you are as well. You're not perfect, you're flawed, but so many of us have that in common. And those flaws and imperfections, even if it's you being a really angry person, that actually makes you vulnerable, in especially in the emotional context, because it's perhaps harder for you to break through that anger and then reach out and relate and connect to other people. So you're actually really lonely, even though you're driven by anger. So you can't necessarily counteract that immediately. So I think that's what I mean by like kind of like spiritually reaching. It's not necessarily a connection with God, who comes off badly on the record briefly. It's more about self-creation and like the possibilities and like what you can do with yourself as an individual.
So I've got two questions left for you, because like I'll be honest with you, mate. I could talk to you about this for fucking hours.
Bonus episode.
But oh mate, well I'll talk to you about another thing that I think we could do come Christmas time to give the book another push, but
Party.
later on, right? But how much do you attribute the success of the album commercially to Mark Romanek and the work that they did together on the video for Closer? The song itself and its like extreme sloganeering is undeniable anyway. Like, I wouldn't do disservice to the song itself either, but it felt like, as a total package, that the visual from Romanek and the thought processes and the sheer amount of metaphors, if you're really fucking looking for them in that video, is mind-melting.
Yeah. It's actually, really good question, Terry, because like I think what the video represents, and this is not me trying to be too conceptual, what the video represents is the ways in which the album really, really came together. you know, like I think it's like a bit of serendipity of timing, 1994, because obviously he was recording it bit of 92, 93, and then it finally came out. I believe it was April or so, Crawlers month. And, you know, it's like everything came together and the video really nails that. Sorry. But the video like really like pins that down. Because it's like, it brings in so many amazing little ideas that aren't really in the music or the lyrics necessarily, and that Reznor didn't necessarily know about himself. So Romanek really adds to it, right? And it's interesting because he's like multi-million dollar, you know, slick, super director. But I think Reznor needed that to step up his game from things like the Broken movie with not Peter Christopherson. Oh God, I've forgotten his name. The chap
Yeah.
from Throbbing Gristle. Maybe it's Sleazy Christopherson. Anyway, that he'd done before, and then do something really different. That's actually quite bold because it's like he could have had something really crap, like, you know, do you want to do something really sexy and just dance in front of the camera for me and try and look pretty, and I'll put loads of like high exposure lights on you. There's a bit of that, but he fully embraced like the sentiments and the imagery on the album, right? Like with the S&M and like the gore and the death and the voyeurism and the idea of like you're kind of spectating on someone's like really crazy mental health decline.
It feels confrontational with religion as well.
Yeah, and I think censorship itself. So it's like it's kind of a fuck you, but it's really artfully done and it's really well shot. And they put so much effort into it. Like they spent a lot of money. They used this really rare film stock from like the 20s or the 30s. So I think it was shot actually on analog film, which gives it, you know, as we talk about analog tape, it gives it that like crazy grainy texture and stuff, which now you can probably manufacture as good as, if not more real than real. But back then you couldn't. And then I think in the modern parlance, it's like filtered to fuck anyway. So it's like, it's super sepia. And it was weird because Romanek talks about it like it was kind of a weird sort of like strange funhouse thing, sort of like crooked Victoriana kind of vibe from 100 years ago. And you really get that like freakish, carnivalesque sort of sense, but also it's not done in like a really cheap, tacky plastic way, which, you know, a lot of videos from the 90s in general, I think, kind of were. It kind of pays tribute to the album itself as opposed to just the song Closer. And, you know, the things like the pig's head in there, like Lord of the Flies, a really weird little, you know, connection back into Piggy and March of the Pigs, even though those songs don't really necessarily talk about that kind of stuff. It's very cool. It's very slick. And then he's got like the still life thing with the fruit and the stuff. And there's like Trent's weird little head placed in with it. He's just another piece of meat, a future carcass. So yeah, it's like it's
a touch
really
of Mark Ryden's on that as well.
Yeah.
No.
But yeah, it's so well done in general. And then in terms of the song Closer, you know, it's like it's kind of like the great single that never was. Like it's really popular and really well known, and it's like one of the most like commonly used songs in strip clubs and things. That's where Trent most often heard it, and he was like, "Oh, that's not necessarily a bummer, but it's kind of weird. It's not really what I expected."
Yeah.
You know, what can you do about your music? But it's such a great fucking song, and it never really charted very well. And yet musically and like, you know, just aesthetically as a piece of like pop art, if you like, it was really out there. It was really reaching, and it was a genuine, I think it was a genuine effort of like mass communication, but still from a really alternative edge. And that's kind of what the album helped to do. It helped to bring like the alternative into the mainstream.
Yes, absolutely. And I always think to myself that Nails are a little bit overlooked in the narrative that, like, you know, hair metal was everywhere and then Nirvana happened and everyone turned up. It's like, well, Nine Inch Nails, Jane's Addiction and Faith No More might have something to say about that, but fine.
Angel Dust.
Yes, yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
And so, last question.
Sure.
The book is out now. It's available. It's called Into the Never. What are you most proud of now that you're out of the woods and the book is done and dusted and the long nights are over? When you look at it as a tome in tribute to the Downward Spiral, what are you most proud of?
Oh, that's a really nice question. I think mainly just that, like, I did, in some ways, I kind of did like, I did what anyone would have done. I kind of like brought together loads of the strands and the narratives and the information that was, it wasn't always the most accessible, but loads of information that was out there, especially on the internet now, because the earlier books about Nine Inch Nails, they were written quite a while ago. Um, and I brought all that together and put it into a book, but I think I tried to present it in a format that was like a little bit narrative and engaged and reasonably well written, rather than just saying this happened, this happened, this happened. I think Trent was thinking this, so he did that. I kind of like try and leave more of those things open and not put my thoughts and motivations into Trent, and use more the quotations and stuff that are out there. And it's really interesting because I never got to speak to him. I didn't actually make great efforts in that. I tried to speak to collaborators and stuff. The more I went through it, the more I thought it would be a mistake to speak to Trent himself, because it would perhaps narrow the focus. And he's talked about it so much in interviews, because he gets like, I think he gets kind of harangued. He does so much great new music and soundtracks, which I talk about a lot because I think they're great, in a really different way from the Downward Spiral, and yet connected, across history. He's done so much cool stuff. I think he's kind of said everything that needs to be said about it himself. I think a hardcore fan would quite happily pin him to a chair, by force and perhaps torture, and say, what amp did you use on this? And like, was it this Yamaha or was it this Yamaha guitar? Was it the 6th or 7th generation? Don't lie to me, because I'll know. And those things weren't so important to me. I appreciate they're important to other people, but
Yeah.
I was just more enthused and inspired by his sort of journey and how it's such a singular, inspirational album. And like you say, it perhaps doesn't get the credit that it does. So yeah, maybe it's that the book kind of like shed light on Nine Inch Nails as a really serious creative force. They're not goth, they're not industrial, they're not metal. They rock, but they also like work in ambient things. And there's just not really many musicians like him.
Have you ever spoken to the man himself?
No.
He's fucking golden, man. It's funny, when you said earlier, I've only had the opportunity to interview him once. I interviewed him when Year Zero was out, and he was talking about the interview we did was actually about, he was on the cusp of getting HBO to sign off on the Year Zero TV show. So that was the interview I'd done. And it was, what was interesting about what you said earlier about Prince is, when we were talking, because I am the reason why I asked is because you were like, a fan would probably pretty much it was for a news piece for Kerrang, right? And I had 20 minutes with him, so I did the first 5 minutes getting what I needed for my 300 words, and then I'm like, right, an audience with Trent Reznor for 15 minutes, then I'll ask what I want to fucking ask. And I was blown away by, it was Hank Shockley and Public Enemy that he was so like infatuated with from a sonic perspective. So when you said the Prince thing, I was like, it's kind of cool that has been such a constant through his career, that he's always looked at. I bet he fucking loves LP and Run the Jewels these days.
I think he's interested, I think he's like actively interested in what other people are doing, and I don't think some musicians are. I think they can like live on their hype, and he's like, oh, I care about music, and he cares about music tech, which is very specific as well. I think that's really cool, because he's sort of saying like, what can we do? There's a bit of the Steve Jobs to him, and I mean that in a nice way, as opposed to,
I agree.
you could say, Yeah.
Yeah, a serious pioneer. Adam, thank you so much for your time tonight. The book is out now. It's called Into the Never. I will, at the very least, also put this out as a podcast on our network for Knotfest as well, because this shit's
Cool.
fascinating. The idea is, because I'll probably cut it there. The
Sure.
idea is come back, I'll share screen with you and we will listen to the Downward Spiral in its entirety and just talk through it. Like if you're up for that, like come back in like December time when it's Christmas market and we'll give it another push.
Oh, that'd be great, Terry. That's a really good. Yeah, like a listen through. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, man.
I'll tell you what. Just send me some dates.
You got it.
You're probably busier than me.
Well, I'll make sure I get you some dates, mate.
Yeah, that'd be cool. But that's a really good idea. That's great. Thank you.
Good stuff, Adam.
And thanks for your time as well. I really appreciate it.
And
it really helps.
I cannot wait for the book to arrive, man. Salivating for it. Oh, shit. Before you go, everyone always asks, what's your favourite biscuit?
Oh, wow.
Pressure's on, Adam.
No, I've got it. I'm not going to choose a chocolate bar or anything because that's a cop-out.
Yeah.
I'm going to go the Bastogne biscuit.
What is a Bastogne biscuit? You're going above my class my
Indeed.
class
No,
bracket.
It's just French.
Oh, yeah?
So, like you know how there's the band of brothers and they're in the Battle of the Bulge, and they're in like the freezing foxholes and the snow and they don't have enough stuff and ammo and things. That's Bastogne, and the regional biscuit. It's like this really intense dark sugar cinnamon thing, this really like crunchy thing. And I had them in France one time. You should get them in the supermarket. And so I went home. I was like, stacked up the boxes in a rucksack. They didn't fill the rucksack. I took my clothes back and stuff, and jets and all my belongings. But yeah, the Bastogne biscuit. It's a cut above.
Yeah. Well, Adam, we're going to say goodbye now, and as you go, we're going to look up what a Bastogne biscuit is, because we need to know now. A man of culture. I'll see you soon, Adam. Thanks again for taking the time out, and congratulations on the book, mate.
Cool. Cheers, Terry.
In a bit, man.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.